What happens when you go out of bounds in Mixtape? Well, it turns out there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you might expect. In this video we're heading out of bounds to uncover hidden areas, off-camera secrets, and to see how the game's most memorable moments are put together behind the scenes. If you enjoy out of bounds secrets and seeing how games really work beneath the surface, I've explored plenty of other titles as well, so please feel free to check those out after this. Before we get started, a huge thank you to the developers for all the creativity and attention to detail that went into Mixtape, and of course to you for supporting the channel. As the game begins and the first cutscene starts, Stacy talks directly to the camera. Just behind her is this background, and from the player's view it looks perfectly normal, but if we move around the back we can see it's actually a fake set, intentionally built like a stage prop that's never meant to be viewed from this angle. While parts of it can be seen during the cutscene, the heavy depth of field keeps it so blurred that under normal circumstances you'd never realise what you're actually looking at. Surprisingly, that's not the only fake background in the scene. Hidden further back is a second one, except this version is absolutely massive. As the cutscene changes camera angles, the entire backdrop moves around behind the scene to keep the illusion intact. Then underneath the map I found this other background. The strange thing is, I don't remember ever seeing it used anywhere in the game. It could be a remnant of an earlier version of the cutscene, or perhaps something that was cut during development. Either way, it's an interesting secret hidden just out of sight. Just a quick overview of the map, which is absolutely huge. It's kinda crazy considering only one or two small sections are used at any given time. That said, all this extra space does help create some pretty impressive scenery in the distance. You can see the area we're currently playing in here, complete with all the additional details. Everything beyond that is essentially the background terrain that stretches way off into the distance, creating the illusion of a much larger world than the player can ever reach. Also, just out of shot of camera at the start of the game, we can find Slater and Cassandra patiently waiting for their cue. It's a reminder that characters don't always simply appear when the camera turns towards them. They're often just standing out of shot, ready for the scene to begin. Interestingly, the game sometimes uses multiple versions of the same character during a single cutscene. While one model performs the action seen by the player, another may be positioned elsewhere, ready for the later shot or animation. We can also find developer cubes scattered throughout the out of bounds areas. In some cases they're even visible to the player if you know where to look. We'll be taking a closer look at one of these later in the video, as it turns out to have a rather interesting purpose. These cubes aren't the only hidden objects lurking behind the scenes either. During the cutscenes, these strange cubes and giant white panels appear. At first glance, they don't seem to serve any obvious purpose. The player never gets to see them, but they're most likely being used to help control the lighting and various other aspects of how the cutscenes work. As this cutscene takes us over the bridge, we're given a rundown of the plan that drives the rest of the game's story. The information appears on the screen as a series of images, helping to explain what's about to unfold. Funnily enough, those same images aren't just being overlaid onto the screen. If we head beneath the bridge, we can find them hidden underneath the map, alongside the desk used in the scene. It's another clever shortcut, allowing the game to render everything in the world itself, even if the player was never meant to see where it was all being stored. Just over these mountains we can find the next part of the scene, tucked away on the other side of the map. Under normal circumstances you'd never know it was there, but from out of bounds it's easy to see how several of the game's locations coexist within the same world space. Once inside the Rockford house, the wider map is completely removed, leaving only the scenery that can be seen through the windows. Everything else beyond that ceases to exist. A clever optimisation that ensures the game isn't wasting resources rendering areas that players can never see. And if you were wondering what's downstairs in the house, considering we barely get to see any of it during the game, here it is. Hidden away are a few areas the camera never really shows, including the rest of the kitchen, a piano, and even a dining room. It's another nice little detail that most players will never get the chance to see. Probably one of the most talked about moments in the game is the kissing scene. Naturally, I wanted to see what was going on behind the camera. As it turns out, the entire sequence takes place on a tiny outcrop of rock, floating in an otherwise empty space. The The distant scenery isn't part of a larger world either. Yet again, it's simply a giant backdrop placed behind the set. Also, we never get to see the boy in the scene, so here he is. I genuinely don't know how to describe this scene other than what you're looking at is the complete setup for the sequence. 2 giant floating mouths, oversized tongues, and practically nothing else. Stacy's mouth also appears to have a spare set of teeth hidden inside the first one. I'm not totally sure why this is, unless it's simply to fill in any gaps that may appear as the mouths move. It's one of those moments where the behind the scenes version certainly looks far crazier than the final scene itself, and that's really saying something in this case. The next sequence, appropriately titled Headbanging, starts off inside a car. From the player's perspective, everything appears fairly normal, with the scenery moving past the windows to create the illusion of a journey through town. If we look a little closer though, we can already see hints of how the effect is being achieved, and once we take the camera out of bounds, we can clearly see the scale of it. Rather than driving through a fully built environment, the entire scene is set up inside what looks like a film studio. The car sits stationary in the middle, surrounded by enormous screens displaying the passing scenery. The game does occasionally give the player brief glimpses of this setup through the normal camera angles, but it's only when we pull the camera back that the full trick is revealed. It's a clever piece of visual storytelling and a fitting approach for the game that's so heavily inspired by music and video. The last part of the scene takes place in a completely different area. Believe it or not, those tiny lights you see in the distance aren't just part of the backdrop. They're attached to fully 3D house models sitting way over on the horizon. To be fair, the houses are incredibly low detail, but at that distance they'd never need to be anything more. It's a simple trick but an effective one, and as before, it helps create the illusion of a much larger world beyond the playable area. Here is the ending to the shopping cart bomb sequence. While the scene looks seamless during normal gameplay, certain camera angles begin to reveal how it's really constructed behind the scenes. Move the camera just a little further than intended, and some of the tricks used to create the moment start to become surprisingly obvious. As always, it's fascinating to see how much of the illusion relies on careful camera placement and a little bit of movie magic. The same can be said for the lost media sequence. As the camera emerges from the darkness and moves into the scene, it creates the impression that we're travelling through a miniature box of tapes and wires. However, what appears to be darkness is actually a large black tube, complete with wires running through the middle of it. What's even more interesting is that the camera isn't moving at all. Instead, the tube itself is being pulled backwards around the stationary camera, creating the illusion of forward movement. It's a surprisingly simple trick, but an effective one, and exactly the kind of thing you'd never notice during normal gameplay. We can also find a number of out-of-bounds objects hidden around the scene. Some make perfect sense, such as the wires and even a character model used during the sequence. Others, however, are a bit more mysterious. Hidden away are things like this flat sand texture and an enormous boulder, neither of which seem to have any obvious connection to the scene itself. Whatever the reason they are here, they're yet another reminder that once you step out of bounds, you never quite know what you're going to find. While searching through Debbie's room for the key, we end up rummaging through a drawer of her personal belongings. Most of the items are fairly ordinary, but a few contain some rather unusual messages. One of the stranger items is this roll-in-one package. Rather than a normal description, it's covered in bizarre ramblings about liminal spaces, meta-advertising, hospital bills, being a bit sad, and even battles with death. Whether it's an inside joke from the developers or just intentionally absurd filler text, your guess is as good as mine. After this, we pick up a shell and are treated to a brief flashback of a beach. During the sequence, we can see the shadow of someone standing beside us, but the game never clearly reveals who it is, although we assume it to be Debbie. What's interesting is that although we never actually see Debbie during the game, other than in photographs, by spinning the camera, we can finally reveal Debbie herself. Despite never properly appearing on screen, the developers went to the effort of creating a full model for her. It's one of those hidden details that would have remained completely invisible if we hadn't gone looking behind the scenes. Another mysterious item found in Debbie's room is this locked box. Personally, I never managed to open it during my playthrough, and at the time, I couldn't find much information explaining what was inside. Looking through the box, I discovered that its contents are made up of several flat layers, stacked behind one another. At first, it wasn't entirely clear what I was looking at. However, after lining up the camera correctly and looking up through the box, the purpose becomes much more obvious. Each individual layer contains only part of the image, but when viewed from the intended angle, they combine to create a single picture, almost like a three-dimensional pop-up book. Whether this is part of a puzzle that I missed, a secret waiting to be discovered, or simply abandoned content left behind by the developers, I honestly don't know. If you've managed to get inside the box, or know what its purpose is, let me know in the comments, as there's a chance we're looking at something very few people have ever seen before. On a related note, by taking a look at the letter we find in Debbie's closet, it turns out the entire note isn't read aloud during the accompanying dialogue. While listening to the narration and comparing it to the text itself, I noticed that several lines written on the note are omitted completely. Whether this was done to improve the pacing of the scene, I'm not entirely sure. What's interesting is that the missing lines aren't just filler text. They reveal a more personal side of Debbie, as she apologises to Stacy for not taking her on more adventures, promises to make it up to her, and writes that she'll miss her more than anything. It's a curious omission, especially since players relying on the spoken dialogue may never realise this extra character development is hidden within the note.
I look like a child. I can't hand over money with these little hands. Slater, you do it. You're the one with the mustache.
While there may not be much to see inside the shop itself, outside we can find one of these enormous spheres hidden out of bounds. It also provides a great example of what some of these mysterious floating developer objects are actually used for.
Try and make the grandest slushie ever.
For instance, after creating a slushie, the game suddenly displays this colourful animated background behind the cup. At first glance, it looks like a simple video placed in front of the camera, like we saw earlier, but that's not quite what's happening. Instead, the camera is briefly teleported inside the giant sphere. Interestingly, the effect doesn't seem to come from the sphere itself, but rather from entering it. The moment the camera touches the sphere, a post-processing effect is applied, creating the psychedelic backdrop we see behind the slushie. It's a good reminder that not everything out of bounds is leftover content or developer clutter. Sometimes these odd-looking objects are performing very specific jobs that a player would never normally notice. You may not realise it, but every movement you make inside the photo booth is being captured live by the game. As the scene plays out, your actions are continuously fed to the stack of photographs that emerge from the machine at the end. Once a picture is taken, the game effectively freezes that moment and converts it into one of the photos that appear in the final strip. If you've made it this far into the video, you can probably take an educated guess as to how the moving train sequence works. That's right, it's another giant backdrop positioned just outside the carriage. Rather than moving the train through a fully built world, the game creates the illusion of motion by placing a moving background outside the windows. When the player enters a specific carriage, a trigger activates that changes the backdrop, adjusts the lighting, updates the sound effects, and even repositions the camera. Then, as soon as you leave the carriage, everything is switched back to normal. It's a surprisingly simple trick, but an effective one, and by this point it's becoming clear that Mixtape relies heavily on cleverly stagecraft and carefully controlled camera work to create many of its most memorable moments. Downstairs in Cassandra's house is almost non-existent, which isn't too surprising considering we barely get to see this area until the very final moments of the game. While exploring, however, I noticed this car wheel poking through the wall, and after taking a closer look, it turns out there's an entire police car hidden away inside the garage. Strangely though, it's missing the rear wheels for some reason. What's even more confusing is that I'm not entirely sure why this vehicle is here in the first place. The police car that Cassandra's father drives away in later in the game is stored elsewhere beneath the map, meaning this appears to be a completely separate vehicle. It's yet another one of those odd out-of-bounds discoveries that raises more questions than it answers. One of the more interactive parts of the game is the stone skipping sequence, and hidden out of bounds is something rather unexpected. Just over this hill we can find a pterosaur, and I'm not entirely sure what it's doing here. Later in the game we encounter the dinosaur theme park, so it could be an intentional tease or Easter egg hidden away for curious players. On the other hand, it could just simply be a leftover asset that was never added to the scene. That is alongside the various other objects that emerge from the water throughout the minigame for players to hit with their stones. During the softball sequence, every successful home run causes the stadium to grow larger and more elaborate. What starts as a relatively modest venue gradually transforms into a huge arena, eventually complete with packed stands, giant screens and even jets flying overhead. Out of bounds we can see how this effect is achieved. The various versions of the arena are hidden at different levels beneath the map, waiting to be brought into the scene when needed. From this angle we can even spot the developer cubes moving alongside the individual stadium sections as they rise into position. It's a fascinating glimpse behind the scenes. If we fly out of bounds at the start of the toilet roll sequence, we can spot what appears to be a handful of random objects hidden behind these houses. Among them are a mailbox, a pink flamingo, and what looks like some kind of dark structure. At first, they seem completely out of place. However, if we remove the blackout effect and let the cameras keep rolling, watch carefully, and everything suddenly starts to make sense. It turns out these objects aren't random at all. They're already positioned here because they're included in the very next scene. As the sequence progresses, the neighbourhood transforms to include the principal's house, which then becomes the target of our toilet papering adventure. I was interested in seeing how the floating on sadness scene works for two main reasons. First, I wanted to know where the attached bedrooms are, and second, how the transitions from one location to another work. The bedrooms can be found floating high up in the sky, which makes sense, as during the scene the player can't freely look around too much. The transition from town to Stacy's Road also appears completely seamless. I originally assumed the camera was being teleported as it passed through the trees. However, what's really happening is that the street section of the map is floating above the town. Because of the downward camera angle, you never notice the gap between the two parts of map. Another example of how developer cubes are used can be seen by looking at this scene from a different angle. This giant cube seems to be responsible for the lighting setup, creating a large shadow on the roof while allowing enough light through to produce the ring of illumination around the characters. It's also pretty crazy just how high the characters float up to. You'd never guess they were so high from the normal camera angles. The moon also deserves a quick mention too. Although it appears to be part of the sky rather than a physical object you can fly to, the texture quality is remarkable. Zooming in reveals countless craters and surface markings. I'd imagine a professionally created texture based on real lunar imagery. Funnily enough, the moon makes another appearance later in the game, although probably not where you'd expect. As we run through this house, these two characters are completely engrossed in the television, which just happens to be displaying the moon. While riding through the dinosaur park, the dinosaur isn't the only thing Cassandra should be frightened of. If we spin the camera around, we can see that Stacy has no head. thankfully, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. This section of the game is presented entirely in first person, meaning the camera is positioned where Stacy's head would normally be. To prevent the camera from clipping into the character model, the head is simply removed from view. Of course, if the head wasn't hidden, the view could look something like this. And if you've been wondering where the asteroid comes from, the answer is surprisingly simple. It's sitting far off in the distance, well beyond the playable area, and spends the entire sequence slowly travelling towards the map until it's ready to make its dramatic entrance.
Could be a hit.
I'm just a diplodocus, man. Waiting for the next comet.
Crazy to think that each and every one of these gumballs is a separate 3D ball, all packed inside the machine and waiting to burst out into the mall when the player hits the trigger. When going back to the Ritz, there are now some objects inside, though we never really get to take a closer look at them. In this pile near the door, we can find some video games, which are similar to old Atari games, one of which is called Sea Dogs, and the sea dog on the cover instantly reminded me of one of my favourite Twitch streamers, Johnny Beard. Is that you? There are also a few different activities that we need to complete, one of which is using a slingshot to shoot bottles. However, if we aim at Slater, and in particular the part where no man should ever be subject to being fired at by a slingshot,
Sorry.
we get this reaction. We also paint the door, and if we spin the camera around, we can find this wireframe sphere and cuboid. I'm guessing these have something to do with the controls for the paintbrush and roller. Also, just at this point, we don't see it, but Stacy's wearing a t-shirt that I don't remember seeing anywhere else in the game. I also don't know who it represents, but I guess someone is broke. And finally, the main thing I wanted to take a closer look at in this scene were the paint cans themselves. Not only do they feature this scientific explanation of how colour works, but they also contain something even more unusual. Printed on the side is a QR code, and unlike many QR codes found in games, this one actually works. After scanning it, I discovered it leads to a YouTube video. The strange part is the video is set to private, meaning whatever it once contained is no longer accessible to the public. Whether it was an abandoned Easter egg or something that was intended to be revealed later, I have no idea. Either way, it's a fascinating little discovery and not something I was expecting to find hidden away on a virtual paint can. Unlike the other houses we visit, Slater's house is surprisingly large. If we try to fly down the stairs, we're initially greeted by complete darkness. However, after adding a little light of our own, we can finally get a proper look at the lower floors. We do catch a brief glimpse of this area during a later cutscene, but one thing we never get to see properly is Slater's mum. It turns out she does have a full character model with head and can be found on the ground floor while shouting up to Slater about the margaritas.
Do you kids want some margaritas?
No, Mom! Don't offer my friends cocktails. It's weird.
She also appears to perform some fairly wacky dance moves during the sequence. I'm not entirely sure why, but honestly, I'm here for it.
I don't want to take up too much of your evening, ma'am, but a parent informed the department of an illegal gathering planned for tonight on the main beachfront.
You may also notice the sun beginning to set in the background. This isn't happening naturally either. Just like many of the other scenes we've taken a look at through the game, the effect is created by one of those enormous backdrop panels positioned behind the set, giving the illusion of the sky changing without the need for a fully dynamic environment. Lastly, you may have also spotted the huge blacked out box. That's where we fly around while listening to Slater's music.
Damn. No problem. Just gotta pick up my wallet.
As we start coming towards the end of the game, I just wanted to show a couple of interesting things from the final few scenes. First of all, just look at how high these cars are when they're suspended in the sky. From ground level, they're so far away that I genuinely struggled to find them when I started recording footage for this section. they're little more than tiny specks in the distance. Also, I don't know if this was a deliberate choice from the developers or just one of those happy accidents, but once you see it, it's difficult to unsee. This last scene's map seems to be shaped like a giant letter M. Maybe it's a reference to Mixtape, maybe it's pure coincidence, but either way, I thought it was worth pointing out.
Film the party, Slater. Immortalize us.
At the party itself, you may have wondered just as I did, how Camille suddenly arrives in this dramatic beam of light. Taking the camera up here reveals that she actually spawns inside this strange spheroid structure, which is difficult to see from the normal camera angles. Something else I didn't expect to discover is that Slater's hand isn't really a hand at all. When making the finger gestures towards other characters, the game appears to use a 2D animated sprite instead of a fully modelled hand. To be fair, it works perfectly well for the scene, and I would never have noticed during normal gameplay. Still, it's one of those discoveries that becomes impossible to unsee once you've spotted it. As the group flies home, there's one final detail hidden just out of sight. Somewhere behind us, in a place where the player would never normally be able to look, the Ritz is still burning. By spinning the camera around, we can find a low poly version of the building tucked away in the distance, complete with the fire effects still active. While the characters are busy reflecting on the night's events and heading home, the aftermath of our destruction is quietly continuing in the background. One last out of bounds or perhaps behind the scenes detail worth mentioning can be found during the credits. Normally they're hidden behind the rolling text, but if we remove the credits from the screen, we can see Stacy and Slater are still standing out here in the road. They aren't simply frozen in place either, both characters continue to animate throughout the sequence, performing what I assume are some sort of default idle animations, while the credits roll over the top. It's a small detail, but one I found quite interesting. Even though the story has come to an end, the game is still quietly running the scenes in the background, despite the player never being intended to see it. And with that, I think it's time to leave Mixtape behind. From giant moving backdrops and hidden character models, to mysterious objects tucked away out of bounds, and developer tricks hidden in plain sight, it's been fascinating to see just what went into creating the game's memorable moments.